As I said in my Castro-type diatribe earlier today, I love marginality. I love the fact that Western Sydney is no longer something taken for granted by Labor or ignored by the Libs. It is now the hotspot they fight over to form governments. Before I introduce our two next speakers, I also want to make a shout out to two of, we had Dib here this morning from the government, also Daniel Mookie and Prue Carr, two leading members of Luke Foley's team, also with us. Prue particularly has a nice job ahead with responsibilities for TAFE and training in other areas. So, and Daniel, based here in Parramatta, to Parramatta and Londonderry MPs. It's great to have you. In introducing our next speaker, well, he's being interviewed because he needs a bit of practice. If he wants to be Premier, he's got to get used to question time. So, in having Luke Foley, the Leader of the Opposition in New South Wales, and importantly the Shadow Minister for Western Sydney, and maybe most importantly to him, the Member for Auburn, speak with us today. Joyce, we thought we'd invite Chris O'Keefe. You might know him from the beautiful overcoat he wears on Channel 9 News at night with the live crosses as the state political reporter. For a Dragon supporter, he's not a bad fella. Please welcome Chris O'Keefe and Luke Foley.
Good morning, everyone. We'll get straight into it. Luke, 11 months out from a state election, polls are 50-50. You're the member for Auburn, Shadow Minister for Western Sydney. You want to become Premier. What are you going to do for Western Sydney?
Well, Chris, I've got a list as long as your arm, but rather than bore everyone with a laundry list, can I say, above all else, the top priority for me when it comes to Western Sydney is to deliver the best education and training system possible. I think our realistic aspiration, we're a prosperous state, we should realistically aspire to having the best education and training system in Australia and in the world. So when it comes to Western Sydney, an unprecedented schools building program. I'm sure Rob earlier talked about the challenge, but in essence, when it comes to Greater Western Sydney, we have to deliver an additional 170,000 or so school places between now and 2030. We have some ideas there to empower the Greater Sydney Commission to take unused and unutilised land off other departments and agencies that's lying idle, where they're in locations conducive to school expansions or for new schools. I want to air condition schools in Western Sydney. Our summers are getting longer and hotter, and this is not an environment. Students sitting in classrooms roasting, not just in February anymore, but through March and April, and as early as September, October, sitting in classrooms roasting. I can't think of government space, public space, other than school classrooms that are indoors and not air conditioned. So I put up a year out from the election the other week, opened the bidding. The government's welcome to respond in their budget, a $300 million commitment to air condition thousands of classrooms for hundreds of thousands of kids. And beyond school, we have to rebuild trades training. I see we've got Granville boys here, many boys who live in my electorate attend that wonderful school, but I see in the comprehensive high schools in my electorate people who are crying out for a pathway into apprenticeships, training, skills development. The school curriculum is, I think, a lot more flexible than when we went through, but I think we've still got a fair way to go. So increased linkages between school and TAFE and rebuilding TAFE, we unapologetically stand for prioritising the public provider.
When you talk about an unprecedented school build, have you got a number for that, and what will that look like practically?
That is partly why I say that we shouldn't be squandering billions on these stadiums. I mean, the challenge, what the Department of Education has said is you might need to spend something like $10 billion between now and 2030 in New South Wales on building new schools. And the budget's not there for that right now, which is why I say whether it comes to Western Metros versus Northern Beaches tunnels or stadiums in the eastern suburbs compared to Western Sydney schools, government's about choices, and we'll be making detailed spending commitments well before people go to the polls next March, but we'll be prioritising investment in improving schools, existing schools, and building new ones. And we do need to do something about the sell-offs of school land. In my electorate, I saw in Barella an overcrowded school crying out for expansion. Part of the school land was sold off. And at the Lidcombe Public School, the RTA site, which had been shut down for New Service New South Wales Centre down the road, that's fine. But literally adjoining an overcrowded Lidcombe Public School, the site sold off when that could have set that public school up for the next 50 years with enough space. So there's a lot of short-sighted decisions made. Often education ministers don't have the authority to step in on an issue like that. I'm sure Pickley, as the then education minister, I spoke to him about it. Without verballing him, I'm sure he would have loved to grab the RTA site at Lidcombe to expand the Lidcombe Public School, but the government property people had targets to meet about asset sales. So it's about reorienting priorities to say building new schools, expanding existing schools is right at the top, and an empowered Greater Sydney Commission, which I certainly would deliver, would have a big role to play there.
But if you do become Premier in March, practically, both Allianz Stadium and ANZ Stadium rebuilds will be contracted. Do you intend to rip those contracts up?
Well, let's wait and see, Chris, whether that statement's correct, whether the contracts will be issued. The stadium at Moore Park, the Allianz Stadium, there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge. There's still a planning approvals process that needs to be gone through. And I certainly won't stand by and be silent if there's an indecent haste to bypass a proper planning assessment process. And you know, I think these matters, people have a right to vote at an election. Stadiums, there's a big debate about what we do, how much we spend as a state. And I think for the government, which took none of this to the last election, which has changed its policy on multiple occasions since, has had several stadiums policy, or to just wait until an election in 10 months from now and let the people pass judgment on the priorities and commitments of both sides of politics. To rush into a contract prior to an election just to try and tie my hands and the hands of an incoming Labor government would be indecent and improper.
Well, it's about $2.5 billion for the three stadiums. You need $10 billion to fulfil what you want, an unprecedented school build, but you also don't support the public sector wage cap. So where are you going to get this money from?
Well, government's about choices. I mean, and I think the state infrastructure strategy released just about 6 weeks ago made some very strong points. For example, on transport projects, Chris, it said that government needs to reconsider whether projects such as an F6, a mooted F6 and a Northern Beaches tunnel are as significant projects for the Sydney metropolis as other transport projects in Western Sydney. Now, that's a pretty big hint from an arm of government whose advice is to give non-partisan advice. And so we're being honest in saying, for example, we won't spend $8 billion plus on a Northern Beaches tunnel because for us, the Western Metro is a transport priority of much higher importance, metropolitan significance, the single most important transport improvement that's needed. Similarly, the Bankstown conversion is nowhere near as significant a transport project for Sydney as a Western Metro. Why? Because the case for Metro Rail is to deliver new and additional rail lines, additional rail capacity for Sydney. Sydenham to Bankstown has an existing railway line. The Western Metro Why is it needed more than any other transport improvement? Because that line in the morning peak right now is at 135% capacity. That's why the West and former Labor governments, the current coalition government, has done everything within their power actually to cram more trains onto the Western line, particularly in the peaks. There's no more that can be done. It's at 135% capacity in the morning peak. That's why I think the test that the voters would expect the Premier and myself to pass between now and the election is not only to say what we will do, but to say what we won't do. What are the priorities in a constrained fiscal environment? Because there's never unlimited money.
But again, Luke, the Sydenham to Bankstown conversion is already underway. It's budgeted for. It's only around $600 million. It won't even buy you half a station for your West Metro. So you're talking of priorities, but realistically, you still can't come up with the money to build it. And if you're not going to support the public sector wage cap, I fail to see where you're going to get that money from.
Well, 600 million's a new low when it comes to estimates for the Sydenham to Bankstown Metro. That the government was running around a couple of months ago saying maybe $1 billion. Industry tells us maybe $2 billion. And when you look at the blowouts underway at the moment, it's going to be a lot more than 600 million. But I take your point. Clearly, building a Western Metro is going to cost a lot more than converting the Sydenham to Bankstown line to a metro. But we've said the Northern Beaches Tunnel, which is an $8 billion plus project, we won't be proceeding with that because the Western Metro is a higher priority.
Is that because there's no Labor voting seats in the Northern Beaches?
No, it's because we're not at a summit for the Northern Beaches today. Because because there's 2 million residents here in Greater Western Sydney, and that'll be 3 million in a decade, and there's 500,000 on the Northern Beaches. And don't just take it from the leader of the Labor Party, take it from this government's infrastructure advisors at Infrastructure New South Wales, when they said 6 weeks ago in the state infrastructure strategy, you have to reconsider the F6 and the Northern Beaches Tunnel in favour of Western Sydney transport projects. And I don't say the Western Metro's the most important transport project for Sydney because there's the most votes in it. I say it's the most important project because 135% capacity at the moment in the morning peak. You can't fit any more people on the trains. It's the single greatest improvement needed to Sydney's transport network. And if it wins me a few votes on the way through, well, I won't knock them back.
I'll pin you down on this one. Do you intend to scrap the public service wage cap?
Look, we've been critical of the blunt instrument that, in our view, has removed capacity for smart deals between departments and agencies and their workforces to allow flexibility where workers can do things better and in return receive a greater reward for that in terms of pay outcomes and other entitlements. We think that the very blunt instrument of a 2.5% wages cap has constrained the kind of smart thinking you need to improve productive outcomes in public service departments and agencies. We haven't committed either way. We continue to think about it and talk about it. There'll be no wages explosion. Let's be honest. Wages growth in New South Wales is at 2%. It's at record lows. I actually think people in the public sector and the private sector economy deserve a pay rise far better than they've been getting over the last couple of years. So there's not going to be any public sector pay explosion under a Labor government. I understand the need for prudence, and that is the tradition, whether it was Bill McKell's Labor government or Neville Rand's or Bob Carr's. There's always been a New South Wales Labor tradition of moderation on these things, and that will continue under a government led by me.
What about on population? You've been very vocal. We're hearing from Dick Smith this afternoon, and we heard from Brian Brown and the panel this morning. Do you believe that immigration needs to be curbed? I noticed last night in the federal government they've locked it in again, 190,000 permanent immigrants over the next 4 years.
Well, it's all right for a federal government to set it at 190,000 and reap the rewards, reap the dividends in terms of a greater tax take, but then they don't fund Australia's largest city with anywhere near our fair share of the infrastructure dollar. I mean, New South Wales last night got $1.5 billion for infrastructure. Victoria got 7 or 8. Queensland between 5 and 6. New South Wales isn't getting its fair deal, yet this government is content to have a very high migrant intake, and we know that a huge proportion of the migrants who come to this country settle in Sydney. The burden is very, very high. And what I say, I mean, I'm a great supporter of multiculturalism. I represent the electorate of Auburn, and I see with my own eyes every day the work that's done in that community to absorb new entrants, including refugees. We have a very high refugee population locally. But when it comes to the number of 190,000, there's nothing magic about that to me. Between 2004 and 2008, the Commonwealth essentially doubled the net migrant intake. What I say is this city, the western half and the eastern half, the Sydney metropolis is going from 4.8 to 6 million over the next 12 years on the current projections of the Department of Planning. If it took us 20 years to get to 6 million rather than 12 years, I think we'd be better off in terms of our capacity as a state to deliver the infrastructure, the things we've been talking about, Chris, the new schools, the new hospitals, the new roads, the new railways, to cater for a population of 6 million.
Respectfully, though, are you risking looking looking xenophobic or going down the path where we're trying to knock back skilled migration when, especially in terms of construction and infrastructure, with so many projects on the boil, we need people to build them?
Well, why are we gutting TAFE? I mean, maybe rebuilding TAFE for our own kids here would make a contribution to ensuring we have the skilled workforce we need. But I won't cop a bar of the xenophobia line, Chris. There's one candidate for Premier who's made clear he'll never deal with Pauline Hanson, never take preferences from her and her party, never deliver a single preference to her or her party. That's yours truly. There is no contradiction between championing our multicultural success story and talking about the actual number when it comes to the migrant intake. There is nothing sacred about a net migrant intake of 190,000. It was doubled between 2004 and 2008 by the Howard government, and there's just nothing magical about that number. We can have a debate and divorce race from it. Race should play no part in the debate about migration.
Western Sydney Airport, it's going to be a game changer. There's no argument about that. Is it unhelpful for you when you have members of your own caucus, like the member for Blacktown, who is dissenting around the project and doesn't believe it should be a 24-hour airport or an airport at all?
Well, I was the first member of the New South Wales Parliament to call for a Western Sydney airport at Badgerys Creek in 2013, when the debate then centred around whether Sydney's second airport should be in Canberra. So I was the first as a mere shadow planning minister at that time. I'll continue to champion the airport. The policy of New South Wales and federal Labor is to support that airport and to champion it. But people like the Mayor of Blacktown, who's now the member for Blacktown, who certainly did not campaign against the airport when he ran for the seat of Blacktown and got 80% of the vote.
Is that because you told him not to?
No. He said...
His views are pretty well known.
Yeah, what he said to me when I met him in Mount Druitt, about the prospect of saddling up for us in the by-election, I said, where do you stand on the airport, Stephen? And he said, look, Luke, it's going to happen, but we're quite entitled to argue for a transport plan and a jobs plan. Now, how can you argue with that statement? I mean, he and all Western Sydney MPs are quite within their rights to say that this airport, as it develops, and the Commonwealth's taking the responsibility for the build, and I meet with Paul Fletcher, I meet with Paul O'Sullivan. I'm very confident in what's happening there. But the associated issues of the transport connections and a jobs plan for Western Sydney has to be part of the proper planning for the airport. And all we've seen in terms of airport rail from the government, state and federal currently is a very small commitment to develop a business case. When it comes to airport rail, there's no real dollars attached to actually get on and build a rail connection to the Western Sydney Airport. And I've put ideas into the public domain over the last few years. For example, I think that the restrictive bilateral air services agreements that act to constrain the growth of airports, that should not apply to the Western Sydney Airport. We want to give that airport the right to grow, the ability to grow.
And you're comfortable with it being 24 hours?
Well, I'm very comfortable with the policy that I developed with Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese, which is for a no-fly zone over residential areas at night. There can and will be flights through the night over uninhabited areas. That occurs at Kingsford Smith at the moment, where there are freight movements and other movements coming in from the sea through the night. And I think something similar at the Western Sydney Airport is a very sensible outcome.
On road corridors, it's been a hot issue, especially Greater Western Sydney. Do you support gazetting road corridors 30, 40 years out from when governments may or may not build them?
Well, you need planning, but the Castlereagh corridor baffles me. I was at the Hawkesbury races the Saturday before last, and it's all people raised with me all afternoon, people who'd bought homes, properties, businesses, farms in the Hawkesbury or in places like Cranebrook and Landilo, who looked at the maps, saw a reservation, a road corridor reservation, the Castlereagh Freeway that had been there since 1951, bought on the basis of that information away from the corridor, who then get a letter just last month saying we're going to gazette a corridor to plough a future motorway through your kitchen or through your farm. And I don't understand how that works. The proper planning was done in 1951, and you've reported, Chris, and I think you're dead right, that the government will have to backtrack on the Castlereagh corridor because the community is up in arms in the Hawkesbury, in the suburbs north of Penrith.
But if you're Premier in March, do you gazette these plans to set Western Sydney up in 30, 40 years' time, or do you kick the can down the road because it's too difficult?
No, you talk to the community, you consult with them, you treat them with respect. You don't just put out a set of maps that show a corridor ploughing through literally hundreds of properties without any hint of consultation or discussion first. That's not the way to build community support for infrastructure projects.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, Luke Foley, and the opposition leader in New South Wales. And it's a long 11 months, and I'm sure I'll interview him a couple of times between now and then.
Thanks, mate.
Good night.